Crimea, March 4th, 2026, 2:47 a.m. A single maritime drone running dark across choppy black water closes to within 400 meters of the Chonhar bridge crossing. Its operators, hunched over thermal screens in a concealed forward position somewhere in southern Kherson Oblast, watch the infrared signature of a Russian BMP-3 idling at the checkpoint above. The vehicle's engine glows white-hot in the cold pre-dawn air. The crew inside has no idea what is approaching from below. This moment, 2:47 a.m. on a freezing March night, is where one of the most consequential operations of the entire Ukraine-Russia war reaches its tipping point. Not in a tank battle, not in an artillery duel. In a shipping container converted into a drone operations center, staffed by engineers who 3 years ago were building commercial delivery drones for a startup in Kyiv. By the time the sun rises over Crimea that morning, the Russian garrison command in Simferopol will have received 4 separate emergency reports. 2 of them will contradict each other. One will be marked urgent and then ignored for 6 hours because the officer responsible for routing it is asleep. The 4th will reach a general who will stare at it for a long moment, then pick up his phone and dial Moscow. The answer he gets from Moscow will be, "Hold position, await instructions." Crimea has run on Russian logistics since 2014. Fuel, ammunition, reinforcements. Everything that keeps Russian forces functional on the peninsula travels through a small number of choke points. For years, Ukrainian military planners looked at those choke points and understood exactly what they represented. A peninsula that could be isolated, a garrison that could be starved without a single ground assault, a strategic prize that Russia had spent years fortifying against amphibious attack, but had left theoretically vulnerable to something it hadn't fully anticipated. A sustained, patient, methodical drone interdiction campaign. What you're about to watch unfold took 6 weeks. It involved coordinated strike packages launched from positions that Russian surveillance had failed to locate. It used weapons that cost a fraction of what they destroyed. And it produced an outcome that Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov would later confirm publicly. Our drones are turning Crimea into an island. This is the story of Operation Nemesis, and this is Steel Front. I'm your host at Steel Front, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is a breakdown of one of the most innovative interdiction campaigns in modern military history. A campaign that rewrote the doctrine on how to isolate a heavily defended strategic asset without direct assault. Let's start at the beginning. By late January 2026, Ukrainian military intelligence, operating through satellite imagery analysis, signals intercepts, and human assets inside occupied territory, had compiled a detailed picture of Crimea's logistics infrastructure, detailed enough to act on. And what it showed was this. The peninsula's primary overland supply arteries ran through exactly 2 critical crossing points: the Chonhar bridge crossing and the Henichesk crossing over the North Crimean Canal Zone. Between them, these 2 corridors handled the majority of Russia's ground-based resupply traffic into Crimea. Fuel tankers, ammunition convoys, spare parts for armored vehicles, troop rotations. Everything flowed through these narrow geographic bottlenecks because the alternative, the Kerch Strait bridge, had been partially damaged and remained a politically sensitive logistics node that Russian commanders preferred not to overload. Ukrainian analysts calculated something critical. These crossings didn't need to be destroyed outright. They needed to be disrupted repeatedly, unpredictably, and in a way that forced Russian engineers to spend more time repairing than operating. The cumulative effect of sustained disruption would accomplish what a single decisive strike could not. It would erode the logistics baseline gradually, steadily, until the peninsula began to hemorrhage capability. Which weapon was most likely to achieve that? A. HIMARS precision rockets. B. Conventional artillery. C. Maritime and aerial drone systems. Drop your answer in the comments. We'll come back to this. The task force assembled to execute this mission was designated Nemesis. Its composition reflected how far Ukrainian military innovation had advanced since the early months of the war. At its core were two distinct elements: maritime surface drones, modified from commercial fast-boat hulls and fitted with shaped charge warheads designed specifically to attack bridge support pylons, ferry terminal infrastructure, and the shallow draft pontoon elements that Russian engineers used to supplement the fixed crossings during repair periods. And a second element, aerial FPV platforms operating in coordinated packages, their missions timed to strike rail transfer hubs and vehicle staging areas in the approach corridors to both crossings. The shaped charge warheads deserve particular attention. Standard anti-armor shaped charges are designed to penetrate steel. The warheads Nemesis drones carried had been modified by Ukrainian engineers, working out of a facility whose location remains classified, to maximize concrete fragmentation effect. The goal wasn't to blow a bridge apart in a single strike. The goal was to crack and spall the concrete support structures until cumulative structural damage forced Russian engineers to halt traffic and begin repair operations. Repeat the process often enough, and the repair crews themselves become predictable. And predictable targets are vulnerable targets. The maritime drones themselves were remarkable pieces of engineering. Hull length approximately 4 meters. Propulsion, twin electric motors, nearly silent at low speed. Navigation, pre-programmed GPS waypoints with terminal guidance switched to optical tracking within 500 meters of the target. Warhead, 40 kilograms of shaped charge composition with a secondary fragmentation sleeve designed to damage any emergency repair equipment positioned nearby. Operational endurance, up to 14 hours at cruise speed. The sea state on March 4th was moderate. 1-meter swells, sufficient to mask the drone's acoustic signature from checkpoint sentries standing on the bridge decking above. Russian forces had installed hydrophone sensors at both crossings in late 2025, following earlier Ukrainian maritime drone operations in the Black Sea. This was the first major obstacle Nemesis planners had to solve. And here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The solution was noise. Ukrainian engineers had determined through testing that the hydrophone arrays were calibrated to detect the specific acoustic signature of their earlier drone models. Faster, louder, with a distinctive propeller cavitation pattern. The modified Nemesis drones ran at lower RPM, generating a noise floor that sat below the detection threshold the Russian arrays were tuned for. The Russians had hardened against the threat they knew. Nemesis had become the threat they didn't. By February 15, 2026, the task force had reached operational readiness. Launch sites were concealed in agricultural buildings and abandoned processing facilities in southern Kherson Oblast. Locations selected specifically because their industrial infrastructure made it difficult for Russian surveillance drones to distinguish them from inactive civilian sites. Ukrainian electronic warfare units had mapped Russian UAV patrol patterns over the area with enough precision to identify the gaps, windows of 12 to 17 minutes during which a launch operation could be conducted without detection probability exceeding acceptable thresholds. The first strike package launched on February 19th at 11:52 p.m. 6 maritime drones, running in 2 waves of 3, targeted the northern approach pylons of the Chonhar crossing. Simultaneously, a package of 8 FPV drones targeted the Russian vehicle staging area 4 kilometers north of the bridge, where a convoy of fuel tankers had been observed by satellite imagery holding overnight before attempting the crossing in daylight. The FPV operators were working from thermal imagery fed through an encrypted relay. The actual operators positioned far enough from the launch site that even a successful Russian counter-battery strike on the drone signals would not reach them. Each FPV drone in this package carried a 2-kilogram shaped charge warhead, smaller than an anti-armor variant, optimized for penetrating the thin-skin fuel storage sections of tanker vehicles. The maritime drones reached the bridge pylons at 12:31 a.m. on February 20th. Stay with me. because what happens in the next 18 minutes restructures the entire Russian logistics operation across the peninsula. The first detonation struck Pylon 7 of the northern span. The shaped charge performed exactly as designed. Not a catastrophic collapse, but a stress fracture propagating through approximately 60% of the pylon's load-bearing cross-section. The second drone, arriving 40 seconds later, struck Pylon 9. The third placed its charge at the base of the emergency vehicle ramp on the western approach. Russian engineers on duty at the crossing initially classified the first detonation as a possible underwater mine strike. There was a brief period of confusion about whether the crossing had been preceded with bottom mines during a previous operation. This confusion cost them 11 minutes of response time. By the time the duty officer at the crossing had correctly identified the threat and broadcast an alert, the second wave of 3 maritime drones was already inside the hydrophone detection envelope. 2 of the 3 second-wave drones struck their targets. The third was intercepted by a Russian patrol boat that had responded to the first alert, engaged with a machine gun at approximately 200 meters range and destroyed before reaching the bridge. 1 out of 6 drones lost to active countermeasures. Nemesis operators recorded that as an acceptable attrition rate. Simultaneously, 4 kilometers north, the FPV package was already executing. The fuel tanker convoy was a column of 11 vehicles. Russian drivers, following standard nighttime security protocol, had parked with lights off and engines running for heating. The thermal signature of 11 running diesel engines against the cold February night air was, from the perspective of the FPV operator's thermal cameras, almost insultingly clear. The first FPV drone impacted the lead tanker at 12:29 a.m., 2 minutes before the maritime drones reached the bridge, timed to maximize the confusion of Russian responders who would now be processing simultaneous alerts from 2 separate locations. The shaped charge penetrated the tanker's thin aluminum shell. The diesel fuel, approximately 20,000 liters, ignited. The fireball was visible from Ukrainian observation posts 11 kilometers away. It illuminated the surrounding terrain well enough that the second and third FPV operators, switching from thermal to optical tracking, reported dramatically improved target resolution. In the next 14 minutes, Nemesis FPV crews struck 7 of the remaining 10 fuel tankers. The other 3 managed to move, with 2 escaping north up the road and 1 veering off into a field where it bogged in soft ground and was subsequently abandoned by its driver. When Ukrainian signals intelligence units processed the intercepted communications from that night, what emerged was a picture of cascading institutional failure. The checkpoint commander at Chonhar was simultaneously reporting to 2 different superior headquarters, his immediate chain of command and a direct line to a logistics coordination center in Simferopol, and receiving contradictory instructions from both. One headquarters told him to halt all traffic until engineers could assess the bridge damage. The other told him to maintain traffic flow because a priority ammunition convoy was scheduled to cross at 3 a.m. The ammunition convoy crossed at 3:17 a.m., with the bridge operating at reduced load capacity with 2 damaged pylons, and with Russian engineers still unsure of the structural integrity. One intercepted communication from that night has become something of a grim landmark in the OSINT community tracking this operation. A logistics officer, identified in the intercept as Colonel Sergei Volkov, telling a subordinate, "Tell them to drive fast and pray." Nemesis launched again 4 nights later. This is where the doctrine becomes visible. Not one decisive strike, a pattern, a rhythm, a systematic grinding of Russian repair capacity against Ukrainian strike tempo. The second package, launched February 24th, targeted the Henichesk crossing, the second primary artery. 4 maritime drones against the bridge structure. 12 FPV drones against the repair equipment and engineering vehicles that Russian forces had positioned at the crossing following the February 20th strike on Chonhar. Here's what's important about this phase of the operation. Nemesis was not primarily targeting infrastructure. It was targeting Russian repair capacity. by destroying the engineering vehicles, the cranes, the pontoon bridge sections stored for emergency deployment, by systematically striking the means of recovery rather than only the object being recovered. Ukrainian planners were compressing the Russian military's ability to respond to each subsequent strike. Every crane destroyed at Henichesk on February 24th meant the next bridge strike would take longer to repair. The campaign was eating itself deeper into Russian logistics with each successive package. OSINT analysts tracking satellite imagery of both crossings began publishing findings through open-source channels in late February. The imagery showed what Ukrainian planners already knew. Both crossing sites now had visible construction debris in the water, extended periods of reduced or halted traffic, and a growing cluster of Russian military engineering vehicles, a cluster that was itself becoming a target-rich environment. How many vehicles did Ukraine ultimately destroy across the 6-week Nemesis campaign? A. 23, B. 38, or C. 50? We'll give you the answer before the end. Keep watching. By the end of February 2026, Crimea's fuel logistics picture had begun to deteriorate in measurable ways. Ukrainian intelligence assessments, later corroborated by intercepted Russian administrative communications, indicated that peninsula-wide diesel reserves had dropped to approximately 60% of the baseline level maintained through January. Not yet critical, but the trajectory was clear, and the Russian garrison command in Simferopol was now aware of it. The Russian response took 3 forms. First, attempts to accelerate Kerch Strait bridge logistics. More convoy scheduling, longer operating hours, increased throughput. The problem was that the Kerch Bridge had its own capacity constraints and its own vulnerability profile. Ukrainian naval drone teams had been operating against Black Sea Fleet assets for years, and the strait's approaches were now seeded with surveillance infrastructure that made any mass logistics movement highly visible. Second, a helicopter resupply corridor across the Kerch Strait, activated in early March as peninsula fuel reserves continued to fall. Mi-8 transport helicopters, flying under Russian air defense cover, were tasked with moving high-priority fuel and ammunition. The corridor was real, but its capacity was nowhere near sufficient against what a peninsula garrison requires. A Mi-8 carries approximately 3 tons of cargo. A single fuel tanker carries 20,000 liters, roughly 18 tons. The math was punishing. And here's where the second layer of the Nemesis operation becomes clear. Ukrainian naval drone teams had anticipated the helicopter corridor, not with specific intelligence, not with reporting that said, Russia will activate helicopter resupply on this date, but with operational logic. A peninsula under supply pressure will reach for aerial resupply. Aerial resupply through the Kerch Strait requires flying predictable routes. Predictable routes are observable. Ukrainian air defense assets, repositioned to coastal positions along the Kherson coast and the newly stabilized lines near the Crimean approaches, now had overlapping coverage of the strait's northern approaches. Russian helicopter pilots, forced to fly above the minimum altitude at which Ukrainian surface drone seeding operations made low-level flight suicidal, were operating at altitudes that brought them into the engagement envelope of mobile air defense systems. The first confirmed helicopter intercept happened on March 7th, when a Ukrainian NASAMS battery engaged and destroyed a Mi-8MT over the northern Kerch approaches. The helicopter was carrying fuel containers. The wreckage, photographed by Ukrainian drone operators, showed the characteristic debris pattern of ruptured aviation fuel bladders in the water. Russian pilots adjusted. Further altitude increases, wider deviation routes, reduced sortie tempo. Each adjustment reduced the corridor's effectiveness. By the second week of March, the helicopter corridor was delivering perhaps 12% of what Crimea's garrison required in high-priority supplies. It was a gesture, not a solution. Put yourself in the position of a Russian garrison commander in Simferopol during the second week of March 2026. Your fuel reserves are falling. Your primary overland crossings are being struck on a cycle you cannot predict, with drones you cannot reliably intercept, from positions you cannot locate. your helicopter corridor is partially neutralized. Your requests to Moscow for additional air defense assets to cover the crossings, requests filed on February 28th, have produced acknowledgement, but no equipment. The armored vehicles your garrison relies on are being rationed diesel at levels that prevent training exercises, patrol rotations, and rapid redeployment. Going through the intercepted communications from this period, one detail kept nagging me: the requests for civilian vehicle requisitioning authorization. This wasn't a military measure being proposed as policy. This was garrison officers asking permission to commandeer civilian cars and trucks because they didn't have enough military fuel transport capacity left to sustain basic operations. That's how deep the logistics erosion had cut. The Nemesis campaign's 6th week brought its most ambitious strike package, March 18th. The planning had been underway for 3 weeks, a coordinated simultaneous strike on both crossings, the Kerch Strait ferry terminal infrastructure, and a Russian rail transfer hub north of Jankoy that served as the primary inland distribution point for supplies once they'd crossed into Crimea. 4 separate strike elements, 3 different drone types, launch windows staggered by location, but timed to produce simultaneous impact events across a geographic spread of approximately 200 kilometers. The operational complexity was significant. This was not a startup conducting its first drone test. This was a task force that had spent 6 weeks refining its strike mechanics, learning Russian response patterns, and building the operational confidence to attempt something at this scale. Here's the take that'll probably generate some disagreement. Russia's fundamental failure in confronting the Nemesis campaign wasn't tactical, it was institutional. The Russian military system, built for mass industrial warfare, simply did not have the decision-making speed required to counter an adversary operating at drone warfare tempo. Each individual Ukrainian strike required a Russian response at multiple command levels: assessment, authorization, resource allocation. By the time that cycle completed, Nemesis had already extracted its operational value, and the crews were preparing the next package. A faster, more decentralized Russian command structure might have adapted. The one that exists could not. The March 18th package launched at 11:17 p.m. maritime drones against Chonhar. 8 vehicles, the largest single package in the campaign. 4 against Henichesk, a separate element of 6 surface drones targeting the Kerch ferry terminal's vehicle loading infrastructure, and a flight of 14 FPV drones assigned to the Jankoy rail hub, targeting specifically the fuel storage tanks and the loading crane infrastructure. The Chonhar package achieved 3 direct structural hits. The 4th and 5th drones were destroyed by Russian patrol craft, 1 by machine gun fire, 1 by what appears to have been a directed energy weapon mounted on a Russian patrol boat that had been specifically deployed to the crossing area in early March as a counter-drone measure. Russian forces had learned. They were adapting. They just weren't adapting fast enough. At Henichesk, 2 of the 4 maritime drones hit bridge infrastructure. The other 2 were intercepted. A 50% success rate on an operation this scale against hardened defenses would be considered highly effective by most military planning standards. The Kerch ferry terminal strikes produced the most dramatic results. Ukrainian drone operators, reviewing footage captured by surveillance UAVs flying overwatch on the operation, confirmed direct hits on 2 of the 3 vehicle loading ramps, the primary fuel transfer pier, and 2 Russian military trucks caught at the terminal during the strike. Satellite imagery published by open-source analysts the following day showed visible structural damage to the terminal's loading infrastructure and what appeared to be fire suppression foam covering a significant area of the vehicle staging area. The Jankoy Rail Hub FPV package encountered the most significant resistance. Russian electronic warfare systems in the area were more capable than those near the crossings, and 4 of the 14 FPV drones lost guidance lock before reaching their targets. The remaining 10 delivered their warheads. 2 fuel storage tanks were struck, producing fires that burned for approximately 9 hours before Russian firefighting crews brought them under control. The loading crane, a critical piece of infrastructure for transferring supplies from rail to road transport, sustained damage assessed as requiring 3 to 5 weeks to repair. Ukrainian sources confirmed what the operational assessment showed. In a single night, the March 18th package had inflicted damage requiring significant Russian engineering resources across 4 simultaneous locations. The cascading demands on Russian repair capacity, already thinned by 6 weeks of strikes, was precisely what the doctrine had been designed to produce. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened next is the part that changes the strategic picture. Crimea's fuel reserves, by the 3rd week of March 2026, had reached what Ukrainian intelligence assessed as a critical threshold. Reports from within occupied territory, sourced through channels that Ukrainian military intelligence has not publicly specified, indicated that civilian petrol stations in Simferopol had begun running dry. Vehicle owners were reporting queues of 4 to 6 hours at stations that still had supply. Russian garrison vehicles, observed by satellite imagery analysis during this period, showed reduced patrol activity and what analysts described as consolidation, vehicles being concentrated at fewer locations, consistent with fuel conservation measures. The intercepted communications from this period have been characterized by Ukrainian military officials as the clearest evidence of the campaign's strategic impact. In one intercept, a garrison logistics officer estimated that at current consumption rates, with no improvement in resupply, armored vehicle operations would need to be reduced by approximately 70% within 30 days. In another, a senior officer requested authorization to begin civilian vehicle requisitioning, commandeering private cars and trucks to supplement military transport capacity. Moscow's response, according to intercepted administrative traffic, was to promise additional resources while providing very few of them. What would you do if you were a Russian logistician in Crimea watching this happen in real time? The problem isn't solvable by individual competence. The system itself has been targeted. The bridges are damaged. The ferry terminal is degraded. The rail hub is partially offline. The helicopter corridor is contested. There is no single fix available, only a cascade of compounding failures, each one making the next harder to address. Here's the detail that stuck with me when I went through the chronology of this campaign. The point at which Russian garrison commanders in Simferopol appear to have accepted that the situation was genuinely serious was not when the first strike hit Chonhar in February. It was when the repair crews they had dispatched to fix the Chonhar damage were themselves struck by a follow-on FPV package in early March. That moment, when it became clear that even the act of repairing what had been damaged was itself being targeted, marked the transition from a logistics disruption problem to something the garrison commanders apparently struggled to categorize within their existing response frameworks. How many repair vehicles and logistics assets did Nemesis destroy across the full 6-week campaign? We asked you to guess earlier. The answer is B, 38 confirmed vehicles and pieces of engineering equipment, based on Ukrainian General Staff assessments and corroborated through satellite imagery analysis by independent OSINT teams. This figure includes fuel tankers, engineering vehicles, crane systems, pontoon bridge sections, and military transport trucks. The total equipment value, calculated at Russian military procurement prices, exceeds $280 million. Ukrainian drone unit losses during the campaign: 4 operators injured in a Russian airstrike on a suspected launch site area in early March, an attack that missed the actual operating location by approximately 3 kilometers. The core Nemesis task force, its launch sites, and its equipment remained fully operational throughout the campaign. Real tactics, real consequences. Steel front. The strategic isolation of Crimea that Nemesis achieved was not permanent. Russian forces have continued repair operations at both crossings through late March and into April 2026, and the logistics situation on the peninsula, while still degraded, has partially recovered as Russian engineers implement additional countermeasures and alternative routing. But the campaign accomplished something that outlasts the specific operational window. It proved the doctrine: strategic isolation through drone attrition rather than direct assault. No single strike decisive, no massive resource expenditure, no Ukrainian ground forces crossing into heavily defended territory. Instead, patient, methodical, cumulative pressure, applied at the points where a geographically isolated strategic asset is most vulnerable, with weapons that cost a fraction of what they destroy, operated by crews that Russia cannot easily target because they are not massed in ways that conventional fires can reach. This is a doctrine that Russia has no ready answer for. Its air defense systems are optimized for aircraft and cruise missiles, not swarms of small maritime drones running below detection thresholds. Its repair infrastructure is finite and critically targetable. Its command cycle is too slow to respond effectively to an adversary operating at the tempo Nemesis demonstrated. And its geographic situation in Crimea, the very feature that made the peninsula such a strategic prize, makes it uniquely vulnerable to exactly this kind of interdiction. The OSINT community has documented this campaign in extraordinary detail. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications fragments, drone footage recovered from Ukrainian strike packages. The picture that emerges from this body of evidence is consistent. Nemesis achieved what it set out to achieve. It degraded Crimea's logistics baseline. It forced Russian commanders into reactive postures. It demonstrated, publicly and verifiably, that Ukraine possesses the capability to functionally isolate the peninsula through sustained drone operations. Ukrainian Defense Minister Umarov's public statement, "Our drones are turning Crimea into an island," was not political rhetoric. It was a doctrinal announcement, a signal to Russian military planners that what happened over 6 weeks in February and March 2026 can happen again, at a time and intensity of Ukraine's choosing. Will this doctrine see application beyond Crimea? Comment yes or no, because the geography of Russia's occupation creates other potential isolation targets, and what Nemesis proved is that the methodology is scalable. The tactical lessons of this campaign will be studied in military institutions for years. The principle of cumulative disruption, that logistics infrastructure doesn't need to be destroyed outright, only disrupted repeatedly at a tempo exceeding the defender's repair capacity, is not new in theory. Nemesis proved it in practice, at operational scale, against a heavily defended target, using systems that cost orders of magnitude less than what they neutralized. The principle of targeting repair capacity alongside the infrastructure being repaired, something Nemesis systematized with its follow-on strikes against engineering vehicles and repair crews, represents a genuine evolution in interdiction doctrine. Previous campaigns focused on the infrastructure itself. Nemesis targeted the system's ability to recover, and the principle of multi-domain simultaneity, maritime drones, aerial FPV, coordinated against multiple geographic targets in the same operational window, demonstrated that Ukraine has developed the coordination mechanisms to execute complex multi-element strike packages that stress Russian defensive response beyond its institutional capacity to manage. Now, 3 questions this campaign raises, and that military analysts will be debating for years. Was the decision to avoid direct assault on Crimea, choosing drone attrition over ground offensive, the right strategic call? The Nemesis result suggests yes, but the counter-argument is that logistics disruption, however successful, does not by itself change the political and military calculus of occupation. Crimea remains under Russian control. The garrison remains functional, if degraded. Was isolation without liberation sufficient? Or did Ukraine demonstrate a method that could eventually enable liberation by collapsing the garrison's operational capability? Could Russia have prevented this? In the short term, the answer appears to be no. The countermeasures available to them, given their existing force structure and the geographic constraints, were insufficient against Nemesis's operational tempo. But the longer-term question is whether Russian investment in faster response systems, more capable maritime interdiction platforms, and decentralized command authority could have produced different results. The institutional rigidity of Russia's military system, centralized, hierarchical, slow, may be more determining than any specific equipment limitation. And what would you have done differently if you had been planning Nemesis? The campaign achieved its objectives. But were there alternative target selections that could have produced deeper degradation faster? Were there moments where more aggressive strike tempo would have been worth the additional detection risk? The doctrine is sound. The execution appears impressive. Where would you have pushed harder? Subscribe to Steelfront, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Chonhar crossing is quieter now than it was in February. Russian engineering crews have patched the most critical structural damage. Traffic flows again, though at reduced throughput, with military vehicles inspecting each crossing for new threats that sensors might have missed. The water beneath the bridge is dark and cold. Somewhere in it, the debris of Nemesis maritime drones sits on the bottom. 40-kilogram warheads that didn't reach their targets, or did, and spent themselves entirely in the service of a doctrine that proved more effective than anyone outside a classified Ukrainian planning cell had anticipated. The wrecks remain. The lesson remains. Modern warfare punishes slow adaptation without mercy. Ukraine adapted first. Russia is still catching up. Stay vigilant.